red camels. And red camels, by that he means a very precious and desirable, sought after form of wealth among the Arabs at that time. So, and this is, giving da'wah is one of the blessings of living in America, living in the West, right? Maybe there's not too many blessings you can count, especially if you talk about raising your children and having akhlaq and adab and morality. And, when you go outside and you get reminded of, so much vice, and you think about, well, is this the best place to raise our children? Is this the best place to live? And there's a famous incident, and I'm sure this has occurred more than once, where there's a very prominent sheikh who visited from the Middle East. He came to America, and he looked around and he told people, he says, whereas we want to move to the Muslim majority countries and we dream about that, and we have this nostalgia. He said, I wish I could live here. He said, I wish I could move here. And when he explained what he meant by that, is that he says, I have never, living in the Muslim world, I've never been able to give da'wah to a non-Muslim. Never. Just because they don't encounter non-Muslims. And so this is a blessing that we have living in the West, that we're able to do. You do da'wah every single day. Every single day you can do it. And how actively you do it can vary, but you're able to do that, and that is a blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And he mentions, the Shaykh, he mentions the saying of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Sahih Muslim, in which he says, whoever calls people to the truth will have a reward like that of those who follow him, without it detracting in the least from their reward. In other words, a person who you guide to Islam, when they fast, you get the reward of their fasting. When they pray, you get the reward of their prayer. When they make dhikr, you get the reward of their dhikr. So you can imagine, so somebody, for example, like, Malcolm X, rahimahullah, somebody made him Muslim, somebody give him da'wah, right? You think about somebody like Imam Siraj Wahhaj, who's, may Allah protect him, who's done so much good for the community, right? But somebody gave him da'wah. Somebody gave him da'wah. Can you imagine? Like, we stand back and we look at it like, man, this guy is a giant. He left such a legacy, and he continues to. And so many other people, that's just one example, right? So you can imagine his legacy, imagine the person who gave him da'wah. Right? And maybe he gave that same person, he gave other people da'wah as well. And so, don't minimize the importance of giving da'wah. And it doesn't have to be a very elaborate thing. What is the most common reason people don't give da'wah? What do you guys think? Huh? Yes? Fear? Okay, what else? Yes. Embarrassment? Lack of knowledge? Is it lack of knowledge? Lack of knowledge? No care, don't care, right? Don't care about da'wah. Yes, somebody else? So, yes. Laziness. Most people, if you were to probably take a poll, most people would probably say, I don't know enough. Even if they say, I wish I could do it, I want to do it, but even if I get over my fear, I still don't know enough. And for them, I usually share the story of Bilal radiallahu an. When Bilal radiallahu an, he was lying on the hot sand. Everybody knows this story, right? And there was a boulder on his chest, and he was getting tortured, he was bleeding, he was lying on the burning sand that was over 100 degrees, right? What was he saying? What kind of da'wah was he giving them? Was he reading them long verses from the Quran and beautiful recitation? What was he saying? He says, Ahadun ahad. Ahadun ahad. And in fact, they asked him afterward, he says, oh, why'd you keep saying the same thing? He says, if I had known something else, I would have said it. That's all I knew. That's all I knew. That was his da'wah, right? So, how much more do you know than ahadun ahad? How much more do you know than la ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah? Right? There are people sitting here who know the whole Quran. Ibn Umar radiallahu anh, it took him 13 years or something like that, 12, 13 years to memorize Surah Baqarah. Surah Al-Baqarah. Right? Now we have 12, 13-year-olds who know the whole Quran. Right? So we think about the companions like, oh man, like these were giants. Giants in what? Like giants in their commitment. They were giants in their motivation, in their enthusiasm, for the passion for the religion. But they weren't like all scholars. In fact, many of us, we know more Quran than they knew. We even know more hadith than they knew. Right? So what is it that's keeping us from sharing this message? So it's very important that we think about, what is it? How much knowledge do we need to tell people? You don't need that much. The famous story, I don't know if younger people might not know Sheikh Ahmad Didat, rahimahullah, who was one of the biggest, best du'at and most famous du'at and greatest debaters of all times for the Muslims, who probably started this trend of debating amongst the Muslims, especially after the invention of TV and satellite and things like that. And so he became very prominent because of that technology. But nonetheless, his story, where did it start? So if you think about it, he says he used to work in a store. And he says we used to have stacks of newspaper, old newspaper. These are like you pick something up, maybe it's from like months or years ago. And he says, I love to read. And subhanAllah, this is, if you're going to give one message to the youth or to everybody really, it is you should love to read. He says, I used to love to read so much. He says, I would pick up something and I would read it. He says, I would read a newspaper from years ago. He said, if I never read it before, it's news to me. It might be expired news, but it's still news. Right? So he used to read. And he says, in the store, the Jehovah's Witnesses, people used to come to give dawah. Right? And he says they would come and they would pick on me, I'm Muslim. And he didn't know anything about Islam. He didn't know very much at all. And so he said they would come and they would, ask me questions. And he says, I don't know the answer. So then I would go home and he says, he found his book. It's a longer story. I'm making it shorter. He says, I went home, I looked up the answer. Right? The next day I was ready for them. They're going to come, they're going to ask me this question. I'm going to have this answer. So he says they would ask me the question and I would say, this is the answer. And then so I would argue back with them. And then they would give me another argument. I'm like, I don't know the answer. He says, come tomorrow. He would go home. He studies the next question. After a week, he knows 7 questions. After 2 weeks, he knows 14. After a month, he knows 30 topics now that he didn't know before. Right? Just engaging people. And this is, goes back to the question or the excuse of, I'm fearful. I'm afraid. What are you afraid of? Or being embarrassed. Right? He was clearly embarrassed. He didn't know the answer. He says, don't worry, come back tomorrow, I'll get you the answer. And so the long story of this is, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, convey from me, بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً. That convey from me, even if it is just one ayah, even one verse, one word even, from the Prophet ﷺ, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, and we do that seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't do that to say, I'm gonna shut him up tomorrow. Because that's the ego. Like, I want to look good, giving da'wah. Right? In fact, this trend is not so much in America as it is in England. In Britain, they have these squares, public spaces, where people come and they debate each other on topics. And, they'll put it on they'll stream it on YouTube and things like that. And, when you start doing that, it starts affecting your ego. Because now there are millions of people watching online. Now you have to get it right. And now you're going to argue even with a bad argument. You might even make up something wrong just so you don't lose the argument. Right? And that is not the intention of the believer. And the Shaykh, he reminds us in the end of this section, he says, whoever pursues knowledge. This is from Sunan Abu Dawud and At-Tirmidhi, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he says, whoever pursues knowledge that should be sought purely for the sake of Allah, but only seeks it for some worldly gain, will never even smell the scent of paradise on the day of resurrection. And so we make a pure intention. We say, I don't know that much, but I'm going to tell my classmate. I'm going to tell my coworker. I'm going to tell him about Allah. Allah exists. He sent a message and a messenger and many messengers. And, we have the final and the last of those messages. And so you're going to tell them, slowly. And you're going to encounter questions. And then you're not going to know the answers. And then you're going to continue from there, one thing after another. So inshallah, with that brief reminder, we'll maybe talk about some tips and tricks and techniques, inshallah, in the next sections that are coming up on how to do this important work, which we have the obligation of doing, and number 2, we have the opportunity of doing on a regular basis, inshallah ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.